So we should be recording now from the beginning. Well, welcome. We have, we're going for quality, not quantity so far today. This is a topic that not everybody's interested in. I mean, a lot of people are interested in it, but they talk about it, but they never want to do anything about it. And that's the world of commercial real estate. How many of you have dreamed of the big paychecks? I'll sell an $80 million, complex and never have to work again, right? So we're going to talk about how what are we talking about when we're talking about commercial real estate? What are the forms you need to know? What could you do? What are your options? We're going to talk about all that kind of stuff today. If you've got a question that really, yell it out or text it, because we'll just do that. So Angela will let me know if it's important. Otherwise, I'm probably just going to keep going. Let's see, how does this look? All right. So this is what the handout looks like. And we're going to take a look at some of the forms. And then there's an explainer video, which took me a while to tweak. And then it talks about a little bit about commercial agents' paths. And let me see, did it put that there or did it there? All right, I don't know. It made more changes than I wanted it to. So let's start with this. Can a residential real estate agent do commercial real estate? How about this? What do we mean when we say commercial real estate? What we mean, what the legal sort of, industry definition is anything that is not 1 to 4 unit residential property. Anything not 1 to 4 unit residential property. So land is a commercial transaction. 5 or more multifamily units is a commercial transaction. Retail, office, warehouse, business operator. I mean, there's a really long list. I have a video called How to Launch a Successful Commercial Real Estate Career, where I go through the idea that you might want to, specialize in a given area and, because there's so many different kinds of areas. All right. So as a residential, so that's what we mean by commercial, anything not 1 to 4. Now, what changes once you leave 1 to 4 units is, well, first of all, the laws change. RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act, does not apply to 5 or more units or commercial transactions. Truth in lending law does not apply. Transfer disclosure law doesn't apply. Right? Well, what laws do apply? Well, you need to have an NHD. I think lead-based paint, is in there. And if somebody died in the property, you're supposed to tell the buyer. Right? But other than that, that's about it, right? That's required. So there's a lot less protection for the buyer, right? So one option, so that's what we mean by commercial, not 1 to 4 residential. What also changes is they're less likely to be in the multiple listing service. The listing agents are less likely to want to use California Association of Realtors forms. They're less likely to have a lockbox on it. Plus, in commercial property, you just don't show up and start walking around. That's not really, much of a thing. And so the whole idea of marketing it and seeing it, and that all sort of changes, and we're going to sort of go through that. Right. So that's the first thing. What do we mean by commercial? I have agents ask me, how do I get a commercial real estate license? I get asked that. The answer is there is no such thing. There's just a real estate license. And that real estate license allows you to do residential or commercial transactions. Okay, so you're cool on that account. You got the license. Next is the broker. Some brokers do some commercial and some do more and some, do less. Now at EXP Residential Realty, right, which is just called EXP Realty, you can do commercial real estate transactions. That means commercial sales, commercial leasing. We don't do property management or business opportunities because it requires special errors and emissions insurance. If you're in eXp Realty, in any of those divisions, you have to be a member of the Board of Realtors in the MLS because, well, the broker is. And the rules are if the broker is, you got to also. So in eXp Realty, you can do residential and commercial, but you can't do everything commercial. Right? And there's some limitations, which I'll mention. All right. If you join eXp Commercial, now you can do everything. You can do property management, you can do business opportunities and sale, leasing, the whole thing, but you can't do residential. And the reason, at least not very well, and the reason is that if you're in the commercial division, they're not members of the Board of Realtors in the MLS, which means you can't be either. You can't join either. Right? So you would need to work with a residential agent if you wanted to do residential transactions. Now, if you're wondering why, and is it set up this way? It's because in the commercial world, they want to draw a line between themselves and residential agents. Right? Your biggest challenge, particularly if you go up the value scale, as being an agent who does residential and commercial, your biggest challenge is going to be you're an agent who does residential and commercial. Whereas all of these other commercial agents are going to be saying, I only do commercial, I'm a specialist, this is all I do, I don't sell mobile homes, I don't sell condos, this isn't a hobby, we're all in, only commercial real estate. By the way, Colliers and Newmark and CBRE and all the big commercial companies, they're not members of the Board of Realtors or the MLS. Neither is eXp Commercial. So if you do eXp Commercial, you can't really do residential, but you can do all the commercial. If you do eXp Residential, you can do most of the commercial and everything is cool. The only requirement in eXp Realty is that you have a mentor or you're on a team that's been approved by the California broker for commercial real estate. I am one of those mentors. I was a commercial mentor for Keller Williams office as well as the Century 21. All right. Now, eXp Realty, we'll just call it residential, has a 3-day boot camp and a certification you can get for doing commercial real estate. Right? That's in the realty division, the residential division. The commercial division of eXp has way more training, right? That goes way more, right? The robust schedule, classes every week, specialized subjects, all of that. So at some point you have to decide. Now, if you're going to go all in or not, there are different levels of commercial. Let's start with the bottom level. I've sold an $800,000 commercial property. It was a 400 square foot drive through like little hamburger thing, right? 800,000, right? That's less in that town. That was less than what most homes would sell for. So in the low end commercial where people are wanting to start a restaurant or a nail salon or whatever, that lower end commercial leasing sales, real residential agents can compete, right? Because it's not all that serious. The people you know are the kind of people that are going to be doing those kind of commercial transactions. The same people you're meeting when you're selling houses are the same people you're going to be working with in that initial band. In that band, because I'm getting back to the point of the class, in that band, you would typically be using the California Association of Realtors Commercial Purchase Agreement. Why? Because first of all, you have it because it's part of zip forms. Right? You don't probably have any others, so why not? Plus, it's a commercial form. We're going to go over it. As you move up from as you move up in the strata, just trying to think of a nice word for the use of the California Association of Realtors forms becomes less prevalent. Why? Because remember all those snooty commercial brokers that were going around saying, I don't do residential real estate. Do you know what they're also saying? I am not a realtor. See, most of those brokers are not members of the Association of Realtors, which means they do not have access to California Association of Realtors forms, which means they don't particularly want to see them. And so they use a system called A.I.R. Now, A.I.R., and if you were joining EXP's commercial division, you would get, as part of your monthly cloud fee, access to all the A.I.R. forms. A.I.R. are forms that are designed for commercial real estate. Whereas the C.A.R. forms are, really a residential group that have written some commercial forms. I have a subscription to A.I.R. It costs like $200 a year. Because sometimes in band two, as we're moving up the strata, the listing agent might say, we don't want to see a C.A.R. form, we want to see it on an A.I.R. form. And you're thinking, what's that and how do I get it? Well, if you're on my team, talk to me. I have the software, right? We can use those forms. Now, what's the difference between A.I.R. and C.A.R.? Well, C.A.R., this won't surprise anybody, is longer because they've also bundled everything they could think of, right? The fair housing, consumer privacy, possible representation of more than one buyer, seller, agency, everything, right? Everything they got, they've all bundled together, and the whole behemoth is 27 pages long. If you include all of the things they want you to include, whereas you can see the A.I.R. form is maybe half that. Now, that's sort of cheating a little bit because A.I.R. doesn't bundle agency disclosure, but you would need that anyway. And on the broker's checklist, there's a bunch of those other C.A.R. forms that they will want in the file that A.I.R. doesn't necessarily have. They have their own agency disclosure form. You can add some, but there's some that they don't have. Right. By the way, the broker in California, EXP, will accept A.I.R. or C.A.R. forms. I mean, obviously, right? The commercial division uses A.I.R. forms. Now, one of the different, what's the difference between A.I.R. and C.A.R.? Because I know you're burning, desire to know that. The C.A.R. forms are obviously written more for the buyer's protection. The A.I.R. forms are written more for the seller's protection. So if I were a listing agent, I might insist on an A.I.R. form. In fact, I'll help you with it. When you say, I don't have that form, I'll help you with it. Don't worry about it. If I were representing a buyer, I would rather have a C.A.R. form. So give me for instance, how is it more for the seller than it is how is A.I.R.? How about this contingency removal, active versus passive? Now, what we mean, let's say there is a 20-day inspection contingency. What active removal, that's C.A.R. What active contingency removal means is that the buyer has to actively do something to remove that contingency. They got to fill out a contingency removal form and say, I remove the contingency. And if they don't do that, the contingency isn't ever removed. A.I.R. forms has what's called passive removal. And passive removal says if the 20 days comes and goes and you being the buyer have not complained or communicated with us, we have presumed you have waived that contingency and you can no longer use it. It automatically expires whether you do anything or not. Does everybody see? So there's more wording that we could go into, but if you're representing a buyer, you'd rather have the C.A.R. form. Just saying. Representing the seller, you might want to have an A.I.R. form. Now, when I said if you told me on a commercial listing and I said I'd rather see this on an A.I.R. form, and you said I don't have one, I would say I'm going to help you. And the way I'm going to help you is that the world is different in commercial real estate. Now, some things are more same than they are different, but they change the words all the time. You see, so in real estate, residential, you're a salesperson. In commercial, you're an advisor. In residential, we give a seller a CMA. In commercial, it's called a proposal. In residential, we make a nice looking brochure. In commercial, it's called an offering memorandum. Right? So we basically just take a lot of the same concepts and we change the names. That's one difference. The other difference is writing of offers. So if you're in the residential world and your client and you see a property and the buyer wants to make an offer, you as the buyer's agent write up the offer and you send it to the listing agent. That is done in commercial, but it's also possible for it to be the other way around, involving something called a letter of intent. Again, as you move up the strata, this becomes more common. So let's say it's a $5 million, $10 million. So the letter of intent, what you would do if you were the buyer's agent is you would first write up a non-binding letter that says, my client intends to pay X amount of money. This is their financing. This is what they want to do. This is what they're thinking of for contingencies, including the real estate agent's commission. Then the listing side, seller side, will come back with their either acceptance or counter proposal. And they'll say, well, the price is okay, but we're not going to fix the environment. We're not going to do this. We're not going to do that. And so we go back and forth with letters of intent, non-binding, until we finally come to a resolution. Then, okay, now we know the structure of the offer, who's going to write it. In many cases in commercial, it's the listing agent. See, when you say to me, well, I don't have my C.A.R form, so don't worry, I do, I'll fill it out. So in residential, the buyer's agent almost always is filling out the form, but in commercial, a lot of times it's the listing agent who writes the offer. Just to say. That way we know it's on the right form. By the way, some of the brokerages have their own forms, which they are going to insist that you use. They have their own purchase agreements. Well, you don't even have a copy of it. So how could you possibly fill one out? Well, you've got to do the letter of intent, go back and forth until everything's worked out. Then they're going to write it up. One of the other differences between C.A.R and C.A.R is that in C.A.R, it says how much commission the listing agent is getting and how much commission the buyer's agent is getting. And it says it in the form how much of it is being paid by the seller. It says it right in the purchase agreement. It doesn't say the seller's going to give you, it's just blatant right there, right there. So those forms are very different, right? And that may have been more than you wanted to know, but you can see there may be a case where you're going to actually have to, and let's look at some of the forms, right? Because I've got explanations. The video is actually pretty good. I can't take all the credit for it. This is what it should look like. I'm using a different system. It should be easy to download if you want to. There's a up in the upper right. Can everybody, is there anyone having trouble opening this document? Are we okay? All right. Is my microphone still working?
It is. Monica asked if you can explain the commission.
What do you mean?
So you just did. You were explaining. I was writing the text. But the commission that is in the agreement, would that be half and half, or how does that work? So the commission that you put in the CRE contract.
Yeah. Is this the right one? Always commission questions. Is that it?
What's the usual percentage for commission on commercial?
It varies. I don't know. So I don't have an AIR contract that's sitting around right now. So what it says is the AIR contract is a contract between the seller and the buyer. And so it would be, how much is the seller going to pay? How much is basically paragraph 3G3, but moved to a different place. What's
Correct.
different is that paragraph 3G3 does not say how much the listing agent is getting. But the AIR contract does.
Mhm.
If I had one handy, I would,
So it's a 5, it says commission. And it says owner should pay agent a commission in amount of 5%. But I wonder percentage is from the seller to the listing agent, or is
So first of all, if I were going to do a class on AIR, I would need a whole hour to do a class on AIR. So I was hoping to keep this about the California Association of Realtors purchase agreement, because there's a lot that's different between the two. But if you're paragraph 27, which I think you can see, I found my copy. When seller agrees to pay brokers a real estate fee in a sum equal to of the purchase price divided as follows. And if you're having, okay, so this, I'm guessing what the cognitive dissonance is. It is under the NAR settlement, MLS settlement, is we're not really supposed to be doing this, where we're saying the seller is paying the listing agent this and paying the buyer's agent that, but none of that has anything to do with commercial real estate, right? There's a law that says you have to have a buyer representation agreement in California, which applies to commercial real estate, but all that other stuff from the NAR MLS settlement does not apply. So here we just say it, seller agrees to pay brokers. And they're saying, notice they're doing it old school, right? Because remember, none of those lawsuits apply to commercial real estate. So they didn't see any reason to change. First of all, they don't use the MLS. But can you put on LoopNet or Crexy or one of the commercial sites 5% commission to any? Sure, you can do whatever you want. Right. But since we're not putting it in the MLS anyhow, it doesn't, the commercial, they don't generally use it. So you would just say it. So let's say you have a buyer representation agreement with the buyer, and that says you're going to get 3% as an example. And this says that you're going to get 3%. What that does is it equals out your buyer representation agreement, because the buyer representation agreement says if you're going to be paid by anyone else, that's going to offset the amount that the buyer is obligated to pay. So it works out the same, but it's worded very differently. That wording has been in this contract for more than a decade. They didn't bother to change it. Was that helpful? May you never see an AIR contract. But anyhow, this is what it looks like. I mean, it looks different. It looks funkier, whatever. But so this is the California Association of Realtors one, which is the one you have access to, because unless you're paying $200 a year, you don't have access to the other forms. I think Pua asked how much the commission is. It varies a lot because there's lots of different kinds of commercial. For example, business opportunities and land generally have a higher commission. Higher being, let's just say higher than average. Why? Because it's painful, right? There's lots of problems, right? So, and sometimes the value isn't that high compared to other commercial properties, right? A multifamily residential, I mean, it varies whether or not you're doing 5 to 20 units, 20 to 30 units, whatever. A lot of times the commercial long-term leasing is all done on a totally different scale, where the agent gets paid a percentage of the gross lease amounts over the term of the lease, residual income. So it varies depending upon the type of property it is. Right, but it might be, but it's generally not that different from residential.
So Mike, that client that I have that wants to buy that land, that would be considered commercial?
Yeah. It's not 1-to-4 residential, is it? No, I mean, nobody's living there. Everything other than 1-to-4 residential is commercial. Right? Right. All right, so there's the good news and bad news about the C.A.R. form is it looks like their other purchase agreement. And the reason why I say it's good and bad news is because if you're used to the other purchase agreement, it won't be as hard to adapt. Then why is there bad news? This is what commercial agents don't like about it, is that it looks like the residential purchase agreement was just tweaked a little bit to make it fit this role. Right? That's the attitude. Whereas the AIR form, the AIR doesn't make residential forms. They only make commercial forms. You see the snobbery. So date prepared, offer from, notice there's more choices, LLC, partnership, whatever. It wants the assessor's parcel number really bad. And that's because a lot of times mailing addresses are not the real address. I can't imagine, it's hard to explain how many times people have said, well, the post office delivers the mail to this address, so that must be the legal description of the property. I'm like, no, it's not. It's not the legal, but the post office, no, they don't care, right? You understand? They just come, it matches, you scrawled an address on the side of the building and you put a box there, they're going to stick the letter in, right? What is the parcel number? So sometimes in commercial transactions, particularly urban areas, but not exclusively, you have a building that encompasses more than one legal parcel. What are the legal parcels that we're talking about? So there could be more than one assessor's parcel number. This part is the same as the residential. Who's the agent? Agency disclosure is required. This part looks exactly like the residential. I'm going to spend more time talking about the parts that are different, assuming that you could watch my video on how to fill out the grid. All of this stuff so far is the same. Nothing to see here. It's got the same contingency choices, pretty much, including you could say, I have to sell another property. It talks about tenant occupied or vacant. This is used, let me show say this. It's in my document. C.A.R. has a residential income purchase agreement. Let's say the property was an 8-unit apartment building. I would be using the residential income purchase agreement, not the commercial purchase agreement. I'm just saying. Let's say the property was land. Well, land is technically commercial. I would be using the California Association of Realtors vacant land purchase agreement because it's adapted to it. So what we're really talking about here is everything else. Right now, multifamily is sort of a toss-up. You could use the residential purchase income agreement, or you could use the purchase agreement. EXP, by the way, doesn't really care because there's a lot of similarities, plus it's mostly about income. But that's why you would talk about, and also even if it's commercial, is the tenant going to stay? That's all part of the due diligence. Well, that's the part I wanted to spend a little more time on because these boxes and things like that look just like the residential. NHD is a requirement. Notice it says environmental survey. Let me just mention that. Now, this is explained a little bit later. And for those of you new to this, the boxes to the left explain which paragraph 15B and subparagraph. There's something called a phase 1 environmental. And A phase one environmental is like the natural hazard disclosure environmental, but on steroids. Way more intense. Costs thousands of dollars. Whereas the NHD, they give you a little report, the phase one environmental binders and stuff like that. Now, what the phase one is designed to do is to determine the likelihood of there being toxicity in the soil. Was there an abandoned gas station, an abandoned paint store? Was there an underground storage tank, et cetera, et cetera? And if they discover toxicity in the soil sufficient that there is going to be an issue, you have to move to phase two. And a phase two environmental is when they come to the property and they dig out all the contaminated soil and take it away. You thought the phase one was expensive, right? So and if you're in rural areas, you're not immune from this because if it had been farmland, there's a chance they were using fertilizers, some of which might contain toxic substances. So, do you want one? An environmental survey, and who's going to pay for it? Right? If you asked artificial intelligence to explain phase one environmental, phase two environmental costs and things like that, it obviously can vary depending on the property. You'll know more about it, but this could be a big issue. Now, if the property is a office building and it's been there for a while, and that it's probably we're never going to do it. Right, but if the land if it's suspect for some reason that they're, like an abandoned gas station, right, then we would want to do that. Point of sale inspections and reports. This is something you always ought to think about, by the way, residential or commercial, if you're representing a buyer. Because what happens if the city, county, etc., has a mandatory, let's say, sprinkler system retrofit requirement? And we find out during escrow, because they inspected, that we're going to need a new sprinkler system in our commercial building. Who's going to pay for that? If there's a requirement that there be an inspection, who's going to pay for the inspection? That's Q6. And then if there's a requirement that's the next one, Q7. Obviously, if you represent the buyer, you would want the seller you don't want to leave this blank, right? Because if you leave it blank, then we don't know who's going to fix it. Title, escrow, and all of that, the customary distribution in this county, seller pays, in this county, they split, in this county, buyer, all that's the same as in commercial. In other words, it's all negotiable. But if you're wondering, how do we follow the same customs as residential? The answer is yes. Is there an HOA? There can be. How is that? Well, some industrial parks have an association. It's not technically a HOA, but it could be. Like if you have a large complex, it could be. But that's really just stuff that they threw in that came from the residential. Notice our additional tenancy documents hidden down here. You would want to check those boxes. Income and expense statements and a tenant estoppel. I'll explain what that is. Other things, I mentioned this in my little document. If there's residential units that are like 8-unit is a commercial, but still residential, you would want to include that if you're using the commercial contract. If there's a septic well, that sort of thing. One of my team members said, hey, we're looking at this piece of land and it says, no electricity. Yeah, you got propane tanks. If you need some electricity, a well, there's no PG&E, none of that. Exchanged, that sort of stuff. Assumed financing is possible. All right, let's just take a look at this initial deposit. I could be doing this going through the grid, but in residential real estate, a typical deposit is 3%. Earnest money deposit, typical. Now, why? Why was it always 3%? The answer is no, it wasn't always 3%. It used to be one. And what we would do is you'd write the offer and there would be a 1% deposit. But when the buyer removed their contingencies, they would increase the deposit from 1 to 3. But then it became more competitive, and some people started saying, we'll just give you 3 right now because we're committed in buying your house, and it made their offer look stronger. So now everybody does that pretty much. Why 3%? Well, it's because the California Civil Code section says that if we're talking about residential 1 to 4 unit owner occupied properties, that if the buyer defaults, the most that the seller could keep is their deposit up to 3%. That's where the 3% comes from. But you realize we are not talking about a 1 to 4 unit residential owner occupied properties. So that section of the California Civil Code does not apply. So what we typically do, what you'll see more often, and again, it varies depending upon the kind of commercial, where the initial deposit might be 1 or 2. Because sometimes land in particular, it can take a really long time, right? I mentioned this in the land transaction class. The buyer won't want to buy the land until they know for sure they can do what they want. Well, that could take a really long time. And even if it's a retail, like the one that I sold that was a little drive-through, why did that it took a long time? Why? Because the current zoning didn't allow for a drive-through, and you would have to get it rezoned or get a variance, which requires a public hearing, or and all that took a really long time. So that also, by the way, the time periods in a commercial contract, don't say, I'm going to remove my contingencies in 12 days. Don't do it. Don't say that, right? Because there's lots of issues that could come up. So we might make a deposit 1 to 2%, could be 3, but it isn't like, people seem to be adhering to a particular standard. Um, so all cash, first loans. So agent, obviously a residential agent, calls me up, says, I have a buyer interested in making an offer on it was a retail space, San Leandro. They're pre-approved. And they send me a Bank of America pre-approval letter. And I'm like, oh, really? That's nice. Does Bank of America do commercial loans? And the answer, well, is no, actually they don't. So did you, mention to the loan agent that this was a commercial property and not buying a house? And the answer is oftentimes, well, no, I didn't. It makes a difference. And in my YouTube channel, I have a video I did with a commercial lender, does nothing but commercial loans, on the different kinds of commercial loans. But one of the big differences is if you're buying a house, the lender is qualifying you as a borrower. When you're buying commercial property, they don't really care about you so much. The fact that you're unemployed, bankrupt, a convicted arsonist, what they care about is the property. They're qualifying the property. And particularly in any kind of property where rent is being collected, what they want to see is that there's sufficient net income every month from that property to cover the mortgage payments, interest, all of those expenses, plus a debt load, which would mean a bump of another 20 to 25%. Now, if that property is making that much money, you're going to get a loan. If it's not, they're not going to lend you money on that property. So there are different lenders once you get to commercial real estate. So there's oftentimes small business administration loans, which could be 90%, 10% down. There's loans are being made by insurance companies, and the way to think about that, let's say you needed $50 million. You need a loan, $50 million to buy a commercial building. Who's got that kind of money? I mean, who's got 50 million just sitting around, looking for some, how about a life insurance company? How about them? They got the money. So a lot of times the lenders are all different, everything, you get the idea. So you need, when you're talking to your buyer about the loan, you need to understand that this has to be a commercial loan for the kind of property they want to buy. Right, virtually, they always are saying this is for land, but it never mentions land. It's very difficult to get a loan to buy land. Credits, all of this is pretty much the same. Verification, I'm going to focus on the things that are a little bit different. Contingencies, appraisal, investigation, all of this is exactly what it says in the residential purchase agreement, right? All of this just copied and pasted. This is what people either love or hate about this contract. Now, as we start, government requirements, corrective or remedial remedies. All right. Americans with Disabilities Act, as an example. Is the building you're purchasing covered by that? Does it comply? An agent leased a business office space that had been added in an attic of an old Victorian. And to get to it, you had to go up this really narrow, steep stairs, and everything was wonderful until they came by and said, you can't do this. You've got a public, it doesn't comply. Right. So one of the questions I always have when I'm helping an agent talk to a buyer, and by the way, if you're on my team and you have one of these, get an appointment so I can talk to them too. But, I always ask, have you done this before? Right, with this kind of property? And if the answer is no, we have to be careful because they may not understand they may not understand all the different things that they might need to know. And by the way, another difference between residential and commercial is in residential, the buyer is considered to be an amateur. But in commercial, it's all up to you, right? Buyer beware. If you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't be buying commercial real estate. They're not looking to protect you as much. This is all pretty much the same. Balconies, like this is mentioned in the other one, but obviously if you have a multi-unit one, that could, come up. Tenancy related disclosures, rental service agreements, income statements, tenant or estoppel. All right, so paragraph 12 is give us all the lease stuff. What an estoppel is, it's a statement filled out by the tenant saying what the tenant is paying in rent and how much of a deposit the tenant has given. Now, you might think that would be kind of obvious from the lease. So let's say I've got a building and there are different business owners renting office space. One of them comes to me and says, look at the $1,500 a month that I'm paying you is high. There's this new office space that's just down the street and I could get something a little bigger for only $1,250. If you don't lower my rent from $1,500 to $1,250, I'm walking. And so I say, okay, $1,250. Don't tell the other tenants, okay? Just don't tell them. Now, so the tenant is paying me $1,250. Have we redrawn the leases? Have we officially revised the leases and signed them again? So now the building is being bought and I'm turning over the leases as proof of income. And the lease says $1,500 a month. But that's not what I'm getting. So what the estoppel certificate says to the tenant, how much rent are you paying? And then the tenant, how much of a deposit? Because the owner said he only had 1 month's deposit, but the tenant is saying there's 2 months. Well, this is something we ought to work out before escrow closes, don't you think? Any agreements that they've made to hire other people, because a lot of times we hire outside services to serve notices, to try to evict people because it's a pain and we don't want to do it. All of that sort of stuff is part of the rental disclosures, income statements, things like that. All right. Now, the rest of this is pretty much identical from the residential purchase agreement. So if you're, it wouldn't hurt for you to watch that video if you don't know how to fill it out. The Americans with Disabilities Act, which I've already mentioned and is an obvious paragraph, is in there, which is, I don't think, in the other RPA. Now, what's different as we scroll to the end, because this is all the normal residential purchase agreement stuff, right? This is it. But if we keep scrolling, I sure hope it's here. All of the normal stuff. Here we go. So, one of the other reasons the C.A.R. form used to be awful for commercial. All it said, it didn't really have all the protections. It wasn't as well written as it is now, but it basically said the seller has to tell the buyer any material facts, but didn't ask any questions. A.I.R. had what was called a property information sheet where they would ask sellers some questions. C.A.R. said, let's take the SPQ. But what C.A.R. does is they clone other forms, add a little bit, tweak a little bit. So they took the seller property questionnaire and they made a commercial seller property questionnaire. And what they do is they ask all those questions. Now, can you see why, if I'm the seller, I might want to see an A.I.R. form? Because the property information sheet that comes with A.I.R. doesn't have very many questions at all, really. But so they would go through, but this is obviously much more robust. It's more likely to communicate any actual material facts. And again, a lot of this is they just took all the parts that were in the SPQ and added them. And so again, most of this is identical to what the SPQ says, the seller property questionnaire. Now, there's, most of this is just, the same as the other one is, the seller property questionnaire. Inspections, what do you do during the contingency period? Well, a lot of it's very similar. If you've got a loan contingency, the loan agent's doing stuff. There would be an appraisal, inspection. So what would you do? You can hire a commercial inspector. Like every inspector I know says that they inspect commercial real estate. I have never had a professional commercial inspector ever inspect one of my properties. Never. But they could. Why don't they? Because usually they bring their own people to look at it, right? They don't necessarily respect the property inspector anyhow. They're going to bring a contractor. They've done it before. They'll figure out themselves. I'm just saying, right? But they are allowed to do whatever they want. They could hire an inspector. They generally, if it's an older property, have a contractor look at it. So the inspection period, you'd be doing the same kind of stuff. Now, in terms of appraisal inspections and looking at the property, if there's tenants, sometimes this becomes, a little tricky because they don't want, let's say it's an 8-unit building. All right, so let me just say this, a lot of commercial transactions are subject to inspection. So it doesn't, if it's a retail space, they don't want you going into the taqueria and saying, hey, we're thinking about buying this place. We're just here to look around. No, they don't want you to do that. All right. They don't want you interrupting the current tenants and the business and all that. So you make an offer subject to your inspection rights after. And then if it's like multi-unit residential, we would schedule one day when the appraiser is going to be there, if you're going to have your contractor look at it, whatever you need to do to check stuff, this is the day we're going to do it, and all of the tenants are going to be told, like it or not, we're coming in that day. So depending on the kind of property, the contingency period, what you're doing could change a bit. Any questions? We have time. Monica can ask me more questions about A.I.R. Or not. She probably left. Okay, since everybody's blurting out at the same time. That's it then, huh? Monica, nothing? All right. Well then, is Badal here?
Hey, Michael, I'm here.
Did you, so have interest rates gone down to 4 or yet?
Not yet, not that much. Everyone is waiting for 15 September. Let's see what they say.
Well, tell us what's going on.
Yeah, I think we have a Fed's meeting on September, mid of September. We have seen the little movement on the market, so we are hoping that movement is because of that the rate decrease at least a quarter percentage, see a quarter percentage. So let's hope for that.
Okay.
I have a question on land. So for the commercial contracts, if buyer just wants to buy a land and don't want to do anything for a while, do still needs to do that environmental evaluation? Is this like a like NH something, right?
It's not a law. Now, there are some areas where they've marked certain areas as being high in toxicity, and they make requirements that you have a test on, but that's rare. It's just something that you would want to do. And in certain kinds of development, the city might actually require it. It all depends upon whether or not there is some suspicion that there's toxicity. I've done maybe 5 or 6 where they actually wanted to get the full environmental. Most of the time, people just say, nah. But
Okay.
it'd be a prudent thing to do, particularly, like you've got a daycare center. Depending on what you're doing with it. If it's a warehouse, you might let it slide. But
Got it. Okay.
yeah. All right.
Thanks.
Okay, well, that's it. Badal doesn't have anything else to say. Monica doesn't have any more questions. So I guess we're done. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye. Oh, how about this? Next week, I'm going to talk about short sales, pre-foreclosures, the gold mine, right? Bye, everyone.